First thing that would strike me about this is that anybody that's going into that area, it's intentional. They're not just roaming. There's one way in, basically, and evidently, and one way out, with the exception of going through side streets in that neighborhood. But in order to get out of that neighborhood, you have to go down that main street, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it's intentional. Whoever is there, whoever either resides there or is visiting there for one reason or another, is there on purpose. They're not just walking around randomly. They aren't, or they may be visiting. They could be visiting friends, visiting family, coming in and out of that area with the intent of something specific, whether they live there or they're visiting somebody or they're there for some kind of work, support work in the neighborhood, for example. But it's not a random kind of roaming that you're going to be seeing. This is not an area that people would just drive through for sightseeing, that type of thing. But they have an on purpose, intentional purpose for being there, and so does the offender in this case. Well, we don't know exactly why they referred to it as a targeted event. It would be open to speculation, and that may be accurate speculation, but typically when we talk about a targeted event, it suggests that that these victims were intentionally identified as victims and as potential victims prior to the event. How do they make that determination? There's a number of things that they would look at. The location of the home, how entrance may or may not have been made, the types of behavior that may be there, manifest between the victim and the offender, the way in which the crime may have been committed from a behavioral perspective. We look at, and one of the first things that we look at in any case is victimology. That for whatever reason, the authorities have determined, or at least initially believe, that it's an isolated incident, meaning that the offender had no other interest in potentially looking at other victims. And when I say that initially. We don't know what the offender may be experiencing subsequently, only that the individual is there intentionally, on purpose, has identified that particular location for a specific reason. Is it for convenience? Well, there's a lot of homes in that area. Is it most likely it's because they not only have access and familiarity to the crime scene in this case, or the home, but one has to ask the question, so why select that home? Why select that residence? Why select those victims? So those are some of the questions that must be asked during that analysis phase. And I think the reference to being targeted has to do with answers, subsequent investigation that's being done in that victimology, and entrance and access to the location, and a sense that intentionally that was the specific location that offender desired to go into and commit this particular type of crime.
So what becomes critical here if this idea of that it's a targeted crime? How why even say that at this point, right?
Yeah, I think, and let me say this too from the onset here, that I think the authorities are doing an absolutely fantastic job.
Yeah.
They've pulled out every resource that's available to them. The local police department has done a great job managing it. They've asked experts coming from other agencies, which oftentimes you don't see. They seem to be confident that it's an isolated event. And to make that assessment or to make it public, I think is to help send the message out to the public that the particular offender in this case has identified these particular individuals as victims, and that there doesn't seem to be an expansion or interest of victims outside of this particular crime scene.
Hey, what do you think about the geographic isolation of this particular home with an access point that's pitch black, by the way, at night? And one of the lights down at the bottom of the hill there attached to the building was not functioning. It appears that there's lights on the back patio here. There's string lights. They're on. They've held this scene for a couple of weeks. This was taken on Thanksgiving Day. But I found it interesting that this one hill here goes directly down into the property, but of course you can also come from the other side. The ice, though, and the snow made that particular road very, very slippery. And so I was thinking, okay, talk about risk level to the offender by driving a car up into this area.
Well, I think it gives us some insights to the offender from the perspective of selection of the victims, selection of the location, of familiarity. Most likely, it's not a random location or necessarily random victims. Offender is most likely very familiar with this area, how to get there, who lives there, also what the conditions and circumstances are within that residence with respect to who lives there, what condition they may be in at the particular time that he decides to go in and make entrance. I think based upon the time, the location, and some of from a victimology perspective, some of the activities that may have been reported that the victims were involved in before they came home that night, placed potentially the victims in a more vulnerable situation, and increased the confidence level of the offender based upon the knowledge that the individual has of those victims and what they've been doing and the condition that they were in, which included, as we understand it, they were in bed, asleep, or partially asleep. And depending on what activities they were involved in, if, for example, they had ingested some alcoholic beverages before they went in there, also renders them a bit more less reactive and responsive, particularly from a defense perspective. And it gives the advantage to the offender, and the offender knows this.
It sounds like you would anticipate in the middle of the night that people who live there would be there. So I think that tends to lend itself as well to that targeted concept.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, another thought is because it's a bit hazardous in terms of access and exit. Hazardous from, you said that there's ice there, you've got a lot of wet leaves. Also the ability to maneuver between the other vehicles and between the buildings is going to create much more effort on the side of an offender in the event that the individual drives a vehicle into that area, which is also elevates the potential risk level of getting stuck, slipping and sliding, making a lot of noise, attracting and drawing a lot of attention from neighbors and anybody else that may be outside. So if the individual drives a vehicle there, it's probably most likely going to be parked in a convenient location for the offender to get to and to get out as quickly as possible, or to a location where he or she had to walk to the crime scene and walk back to their vehicle. So if a vehicle is involved, it most likely would not have been parked there close by that particular residence, but in a position where they could easily get to it, get in, and get out quickly.
So we got a lot going on here, I thought, behind the house. And, we see that screen there. It looks like it's got a rock on it, holding it down. But then there's a cinder block just below that one window there. Now, mind you, this house has 5 women staying in it. So let's talk about and the murder weapon the police have described as a large, military style knife kind of concept. Okay, a fixed blade, and that knife, according to what the authorities have said, is very significant in this, and they're not giving many details about it. So let's talk about 2 things, Greg. I want your to weigh in on your thoughts on why this block could be important or not important, and also why the significance of this knife, what it means to an offender who has the chutzpah to come into a home where multiple people are victimized here. Are you tracking what I'm asking?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. First of all, the block and the block you're talking about is right underneath the window.
Yep.
All right. So this would be the second floor from the backside.
Yes. Right.
So it doesn't appear that block would be necessary to lift themselves up to a point where they could get into the window, because it looks like the bottom portion of that window is just probably 2-3 feet maybe before the bottom. So depending on when that block was placed there, and we don't know when it was placed there, this is a few weeks or how long after the fact was it identified there, Chris?
We don't know. We don't know. It's just there. It's still there.
Okay. So we may have to make a presumption that the law enforcement didn't feel like it was significant enough to take it as potential evidence.
Well, they still have the scene.
Oh, okay. So they're still maintaining control of the scene and everything in it. Okay.
Right.
All right. So what's the point of that particular block? It's not needed to elevate oneself to get in through the window, it doesn't appear. Unless you're very small. That is not what we would expect in this particular case, if it has anything to do with entrance into the residence. But it's possible that we know, for example, that many offenders will survey their victims over a period of time. And sometimes that may be done through voyeuristic types of activities, peeping through windows at night, for example. that is in a location where such activity would be common at that particular location. If knowing that the residence is filled with females, and if there was an interest in any one or each of them, that would be a good location, possibly not knowing what's on the other side of that window because we don't know. Potentially a good location for viewing at night and peeping at night. And that would be, if that's accurate, then that would be in expectation, anticipation, and fantasizing about the potential crime, or depending on what the motivation is. And there's more questions than answers at this point, but you have to take a look at each of these aspects and start asking the questions, which will lead the investigation to the point that you can answer them. But it is a good location for convenience to peer into a window under the cloak of darkness.
If this was night, and if it was, somebody sitting back there at night, it would be very difficult for somebody to see them back there. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's pitch black.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's perfect place for somebody who's voyeuristic to go hang out. That's for sure.
Which leads me into a thought. Explain why, Greg, pre-incident behavior is so crucial to understand, in relationship to these types of crimes.
Yeah, and it depends on the nature of the crime. And in a situation like this, pre-incident behavior, you would expect, based upon this offender's most likely level of confidence, both with respect to the selection of a particular weapon and the manner in which that weapon was used, and the results of using that weapon, that there's a level of confidence there which suggests, in terms of pre-incident behavior, that potential for planning, fantasizing. When we fantasize, any of us fantasize about any legitimate thing, we're basically enacting an event before it occurs mentally, right? And we know that using one's imagination in the creation of certain circumstances in our thought process, we know that we can actually perform better in reality when we do so, depending on how much time and effort and interest that we show in that fantasy and thought process or imagination. The more time we spend at it, the more articulation we give to the fantasy. We know, for example, that athletes spend a significant amount of time mentally, psychologically, seeing themselves in a situation, in performing in athletic events, etc. And that they've been able to determine, of course, that the more time they spend in that they will actually improve their performance without ever even having to go out and practice. I'm not saying you do that exclusively. I'm saying supplemented by practicing, in fact. So that mental practice is exactly what an offender does in anticipation of committing a crime. And the more mental practice they give it, the more effective they can become in trying to anticipate what's going to happen, how to get into a residence, the surveillance that we talked about, the voyeuristic activities, the selection of a particular weapon, in this case a knife. Why that particular weapon? Why not take in a gun? It would have been cleaner, quicker, much more impersonal than the use of a knife. The knife is much more personal. They have more control. It's a projection of the offender, not just into the crime itself, but that intimate projection into the victim. And so what we're lacking in this case to really give it a full spectrum of assessment is we don't know exactly the nature of the wounds. We don't know the exact location of the wounds. We don't know how many of the wounds were administered here in this case to each one of the victims. We make assumptions based upon comments and statements that have been made, but there's always a level of risk that we take when we assume anything, right? So we've got to be very careful about how we characterize certain things because we don't have all the information. It's not out there. But suffice it to say, with respect to that weapon, the individual selects the weapon because they're comfortable with it. It's a personal thing. They kept it. Most likely they haven't. Most likely they keep it for personal reasons because it serves. It can be servicing them, and with respect to anything from fantasy, reliving the event, all the way to a practical use for the weapon that may be utilized for the individual based upon what their job may be, what their activities and for example, hunting, etc., things like that. You may use it for practical purposes.
Sometimes people get the misunderstanding of whenever we say the idea that the knife is personal. It's not necessarily personal to the victim.
No.
It's personal to the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
That knife selection has all kinds of meaning to that individual, and help us understand the mindset of the individual. How much time do they take before they do what they do here? This tragedy.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that it's difficult to give a reasonable answer to that simply because we don't know the behavioral characteristics at the crime scene and how much time the offender stays there in the crime scene with each individual, how there may be differences between each of the victims in terms of the wounds that they receive, what the event behavior is, that is the incident behavior as it relates to the assault itself. Are there differences between the location, manner, nature of the wounds, etc., between the victims? We don't know if there was any post-offense behavior of the victims or with the victims afterward. Because so typically what we find is the more behavior that is spent there in the crime scene with the victim, the types of behavior that are manifest and expressed by the offender toward a particular victim, because these are all individual victims. It's not as if somebody didn't walk through here and throw a hand grenade into a house. These are all very intimate, close, personal crimes. Individuals that in one way or another mean something to this offender and represent something to the offender. I don't know if that answers your question there, Chris, but and we don't know what those behaviors are, and without that, it's difficult to interpret.
Right. What we know, right, is we have 5 young women in this home and 1 young man, right? 4 of, at the time, right? You've got 2 downstairs, 2 upstairs, and 2 in the middle. So the young man was there that evening, Ethan, with his girlfriend.
Okay, but does he generally stay there, or was that just
I don't know that personally. I don't know that. But he's there that night. And, there's thoughts, of folks saying, the offender waited for everybody to come home and then, attacked. And my thinking was that, Ethan was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mhm.
That the girls were the targets.
Yeah.
What say you?
I think that any offender going into that environment knew or expected that most likely it was going to be the girls present only. Most likely the offender is surprised by the presence of Ethan and necessarily didn't expect him to be there. Why? We go back to victimology, but also from the risk level of the offender. What is an offender going to do to ensure the success of their crime? What types of precautions may be taken in order to ensure that success and to protect their identity, to ensure the success of the crime, and to effect their escape? Most likely, an individual is not going to select time, a location, and a victim that has the ability to fight and protect themselves, an equal ability, meaning that the offenders, from a mental perspective, psychological perspective, is going to attempt to plan this thing out, anticipate how can I be most effective and efficient in this, and protect myself from getting caught, getting injured, not from getting ensuring the submission of the victim. So they're not going to purposely necessarily, most of the time, you're not going to see them purposely identify as a challenge a potential victim that's going to present a risk to them. And so I think you're probably accurate. I think that most likely Ethan was not anticipated to have been there that night. And he was familiar with the area, familiar with the location, familiar with who was in that home and what type of resistance may have been presented to him. And then so when you take a look at the time in which the crime was committed and the condition of the victims, it elevates the success level, potential success for the offender. And Ethan would not be necessarily part of that equation. It would be just the opposite in trying to identify potentially who the offender is. So we'll keep our hopes for that area. But he's organized at that level, at least in terms of this particular crime. But we don't know more detail about the crime scene, which would give us more insight in terms of the level of sophistication that may have been utilized in this case. But the fact that he was able to carry it off successfully with that weapon, 4 victims, with a level of sustained aggression throughout the course of these events, from one victim to another, suggests that this individual has the ability to make those plans, commits themselves, goal-oriented, and once he makes a determination what he's going to do, has the ability to follow through and complete it. Definitely, most likely, he's this type of crime is consistent with an individual with personality disorders, as in psychopathology, has been able to rationalize why and who in terms of the victims, lacks empathy, remorse, is able to justify anything that they do by blaming, typically projecting blame onto the victim. Not knowing what we say that most likely that they have crossed paths at some point. Well, we don't know what the nature of that intersection was like. and interaction was like, in terms of reception, whether there may have been a perceived or real insult taken by an individual, or just an obsessive, fixated interest in one or more than one of those victims. So those are all questions that during the course of their investigation they're considering.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.